From the time we are born, we make our way through a world that will always remain something of a mystery to us. We piece together understandings. We build lives. But we always feel an urge to go deeper. We want to grasp the way things really are. But what is real? In the world, in ourselves, in the experience of being alive, what is real? Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that asks about the basic nature of reality.
We explain the complex in terms of the simple. We try to find the simple behind the complex. Whenever we can do this, and it happens every now and then, we feel that we've really achieved something. We've got some kind of explanatory power. And metaphysics can be conceived as, I think, as trying to boil down everything. Trying to boil down and reconstruct everything into the universe out of the simplest possible fundamental core.
The question about what is real is the basic question in metaphysics. What are the basic kinds of things that there are? Now, the only thing I think I want to emphasize here is the following. That starts looking like a question of ontology, i.e., a question about what are the basic kinds of bits out of which you make a world. But metaphysics, at least traditionally, had this other part, cosmology. That's about how the bits provided by ontology can be stuck together to make the unified system that constitutes the world.
If asked, what is real, the first thing most people think of is the physical world, the ground we stand on, the objects around us, our own bodies. A view called materialism holds that only the physical world is real. Materialism dates back to the 5th century BC, when the Greek philosopher Democritus theorized that everything in the universe is made up of tiny atoms bouncing around and hooking together. Materialism rose to prominence with the scientific revolution. Inspired by the discoveries of Galileo and others, 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes sought to describe reality in a way that science could fully grasp. Reality, Hobbes argued, consists of matter, nothing else.
The universe is body, and that which is not body is no part of the universe. And because the universe is all, that which is no part of it is nothing, and consequently, nowhere.
In Hobbes' scheme of things, the human body is simply a machine.
For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer.
But to say that reality consists only of matter seems to leave out other things. What about our conscious inner lives? What about deciding a move in a card game, or getting a joke, or feeling pleasure among friends? This inner stream of consciousness doesn't seem material.
And I think one's led to the conclusion that the fundamental ingredients of the world to generate consciousness have to, for example, to go beyond the fundamental ingredients of physics. Because nothing in the fundamental ingredient of physics is going to give you consciousness. So you need something else, some new fundamental ingredient in the world. Maybe you need something like consciousness as a fundamental ingredient of the world in the same way in which space and time and mass are fundamental ingredients.
A view called idealism maintains not only that consciousness exists along with matter, it argues that reality is made up entirely of ideas. Writing somewhat later in the scientific revolution, Bishop George Berkeley sought to crush the threat materialism posed to religion. If everything were made up of matter, where would God fit in? Where would souls fit in? What would happen to our souls after we die?
Spiritual substances are for Berkeley the ultimate building blocks of the universe. This obviously leaves Berkeley with no problem of explaining the immortality of the soul. The soul is a spiritual substance, it has no parts, and is the sort of thing which can survive.
The crux of Berkeley's argument is that we know about the world only through the ideas or sensations that our senses send to our minds. Since we can know only ideas, we can't conclude that a world of matter exists.
It is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing among men that houses, mountains, rivers, and in a word, all sensible objects have an existence distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. But this principle may involve a manifest contradiction. For what are objects but the things we perceive by sense? And what do we perceive besides our own ideas or sensations?
Instead of making the world, the reality, the final touchstone, that is, everything else is answerable to the world, you make the world itself answerable to our states of consciousness.
For Berkeley, what people think of as things are really collections of ideas. They exist not in a world of matter, but in the mind of God.
All of the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frames of the world, have no substance without a mind. Their being is to be perceived. Consequently, so long as they are not actually perceived by me or other created spirits, they must either have no existence at all, or else exist in the mind of some eternal spirit.
Even in his own day, Berkeley's denial of the existence of matter was seen as odd. One story pictures him visiting the famous satirist Jonathan Swift.
Swift instructed his servant that he needn't open the door to him, since if Berkeley's philosophy were true, if Berkeley's philosophy that matter did not exist, and that the only things that existed were immaterial minds, Berkeley could as easily walk through a closed door as through an open one.
Still, if Berkeley's position is extreme, many people believe in a spiritual reality that's different from the physical world. It may exist apart, such as a heaven, or in Plato's vision, a world of pure forms or ideas. Or it may be a deeper dimension in the world around us, such as Spinoza's view that God and nature are one. Other philosophers have objected to such notions as metaphysical speculations, castles in the air. One argument contends that anything we can't perceive with our senses or prove through science shouldn't be considered real. In the words of 20th century philosopher A.J. Ayer,
no statement which refers to a reality transcending the limits of all possible sense experience can possibly have any literal significance, from which it must follow that the labors of those who have striven to describe such a reality have all been devoted to the production of nonsense.
Hello? Oh, hi, Grandma. How are you?
another argument against metaphysical speculation came from a group of late 19th and early 20th century American philosophers called pragmatists. Reality, pragmatists argue, should be defined in terms of practical consequences. William James explains.
The pragmatic method is primarily a method of settling metaphysical disputes that otherwise might be interminable. Is the world one or many, fated or free, material or spiritual? Here are notions either of which may or may not hold good of the world, and disputes over such notions are unending. The pragmatic method in such cases is to try to interpret each notion by tracing its respective practical consequences. What difference would it practically make to anyone if this notion rather than that notion were true? If no practical difference whatever can be traced, then the alternatives mean practically the same thing, and all dispute is idle.
One thing I've learned from pragmatism, I think that in philosophy we should start by taking seriously the way we think and talk and find we have to think and talk in order to lead our lives. It's no good saying, strictly speaking, the whole world is inside my head or it's just my sensations. But of course I have to think the opposite in order to live at all.
Charles Darwin's theory of evolution exerted a major influence on pragmatism. It placed humans in the perspective of all other organisms struggling to survive. Pragmatists view language, for instance, as primarily a tool for survival and success in the world, rather than an abstract way of representing reality.
After Darwin, it becomes very hard to say that human beings grasp the true nature of things. It's much easier to say they've developed language to enable them to serve various ends, better food, better sex, better shelter, more interesting lives, and so on, as opposed to doing this thing called knowing what things in themselves really are. So after Darwin, the pragmatists in America and Nietzsche in Europe said, don't ask the question, which language gets reality right? Just ask the question, which language serves what human purpose best?
The distinction between trying to capture the true nature of reality versus defining reality in human terms has remained central to recent philosophy. The opponents in the debate are often referred to as realists and anti-realists. To realists, reality is objective and exists in the world apart from how I view it.
And what realism wants to say in general about the character of things that exist is that, at least talking about material objects, that those things exist independently of us, independently of minds, independently of observers, independently of our representations of things. So they exist externally is the buzzword for philosophers.
And the idea that there is a real world that's external to us, it doesn't depend on us for its existence. It's there whether or not we were ever conscious. It was the physical reality was there before any of us was ever existed or was ever conscious, and it will continue to be there long after life and consciousness have ceased from our little planet. Now, that I regard as just absolutely basic. That's a condition of sanity, philosophically speaking.
It can be comforting to think of reality as external, independent of me. My life will end, but the world will go on. This is the reality of the realists. But for anti-realists, we construct reality. There may be stuff out there, but we shape it into the reality we know through our conceptual systems. Reality is like the child's concept of what the blocks will become. In the words of Nelson Goodman,
now as we thus make constellations by picking out and putting together certain stars rather than others, so we make stars by drawing certain boundaries rather than others. Nothing dictates whether the sky shall be marked off into constellations or other objects. We have to make what we find, be it the Great Dipper, Sirius, food, fuel, or a stereo system.
Here's a typical argument. The argument goes, look, in order that you can even talk about the real world, you got to have a language. But language is a social construction. Now, you can't talk about trees and mountains without the words tree and mountain. So any fact about trees and mountains has to contain at least this component that we constructed, because the world doesn't divide up any old way. It divides up the way we divide it. Therefore, there are no facts independent of independent of our language and thought processes.
Consider the question of how many objects you see on screen. 3? Or 3 more still? Or yet 1 more? For anti-realists, Things are as we name them. Parts and wholes are as we define.
Some logicians have widened the notion of a whole, a W-H-O-L-E, in such a way that any parts you like, any things you like, can be thought of as parts of one whole, even if they're not spatially next to one another and even if they're not rigidly attached. So, for example, in this widened sense of the term whole, there is a whole consisting of this chair and this bottle. As well as, of course, whatever is a part of the bottle, like the lid, is also part of that whole, because a part of a part is a part. And also, if you take the arm of this chair and the cap of this bottle, that's a part of the whole, called an Oscar. And in fact, there are some things which we're comfortable as thinking of a single thing, which have disconnected parts. For example, we think of Hawaii as a part of the United States, even though it's separated by a couple of thousand miles of blue water. But now, as soon as you've noticed that you can widen the notion of an object that way, you suddenly notice that there's more than one answer to the question, how many things am I holding in my hands? In the conventional way of counting, if you just count the bottles as things, there are only two. If you count the Oscar, there are a lot more. There are three. And if you count the parts of Oscar or the parts of the bottles, there are many different answers to the question, how many objects am I holding up in my hands? And they're all true, I want to say.
To anti-realists, we use conceptual systems not only to define how many objects we're looking at, but also to define all reality in the universe.
We should think of lots of descriptions of the universe as true of the universe, even though they're quite unrelated to one another, even though there are dozens of them. In the physicist's description, the politician's description, the poet's description, they don't all converge to a single truth. Why should they?
You guys, Grandma's here.
Oh, Daddy, come back.
Come on, you guys.
Yeah. Oh, goody. Grandma!
Hi, babies. Oh, hi there.
What is the reality of a child? Is it different from the reality of an adult? If you ask a child an adult question, what is government? Why is there war? The answer may make you laugh, or it may make you laugh and wish the world still seemed so simple to you. We try to teach children the difference between make-believe and reality, and they seem to learn. I shouldn't lie. Ghosts aren't real. That was just a nightmare. I don't need to be afraid. But what does it mean to say that a child gains a sense of reality? Recent studies of the brain suggest that each person's sense of reality is finely etched into the synaptic weights of the brain.
Perhaps the most fundamental way in which the brain learns is by slowly changing the strength or size or weight of the synaptic connections that join one neuron to another. This is the means by which neurons talk to one another, typically to hundreds of millions of their brothers and sisters, not just one or two, like a telephone conversation. And the way in which neurons interact is a function of how big those synaptic connections are or how small they are, and the particular character that a brain has, socially speaking, morally speaking, the knowledge that it embodies, all of that is embodied in the configuration of synaptic weights. What happens in the course of a lifetime, especially during childhood, is that the sizes of those synapses slowly change. They're driven by experience, sometimes painful experience, to slowly strengthen themselves or weaken themselves. And that changes the character of the individual, it changes the beliefs that it has, the skills that it has, the fears and expectations that it has.
A realist might say, you see, reality is outside of us, and the child gradually learns how to put together the pieces. Look at how many things we learn to think about in the same way. An anti-realist might say, but no, it's true we process more and more experiences, but we deal with them through conceptual systems. Growing up is developing wider and wider-reaching conceptual systems. Realists can agree with anti-realists that much of reality is a social construction.
There really are social, institutional facts, right, that are social constructs. Money's a social construct, so is marriage and property and government and universities and language and tenure and cocktail parties and a whole lot of other things that are important to us. The institutional facts are not to be sneered at. They're absolutely basic to our lives. And that's because human beings accept certain sorts of phenomena as having a certain kind of status. And with that status go certain kinds of functions, and they will organize their lives around those functions.
Probably the relationship between institutions and practices and particular thoughts are much more intimate than we tend to think. In our sort of individualistic tradition, we think, well, there's institutions out there and there's us individuals, and of course we are trapped, bullied by institutions, but still basically the individuals are there. Whereas I suppose that I have a much more fluid sense of the ways in which we are formed in a society, and our institutions, our social forms, our personae, who I am, and my language, are all formed as part of an intricate network in which there is no priority. You might say there would be no individuals if there weren't institutions. They don't have to be banks, but they have to be some kinds of social frameworks in which we live our lives.
For realists, there has to be an independent world if we are going to live together.
It isn't that I hold an opinion that there's a real world. It's rather that's a background presupposition of the way that I cope with things. I couldn't plan on where I'm going to go for the weekend, or I couldn't call my wife up and tell her what time I'm going to be home for dinner if I didn't take it for granted that there's a way that things are that's independent of my representation of how they are.
Anti-realists contend, however, that reality always depends on how society conditions us. If society sends us strong messages about, say, inferiority of women or inequality among races, then these messages become reality for us.
I think a great deal of feminist theory has started from the realization that our lives had been programmed for us by somebody else, and they're not really meaningful lives for us. And take another very different example, a feminist who's going to be my colleague now at the University of Chicago, Catherine MacKinnon. Now, she too starts in a different way from the recognition that a lot of our lives, our emotional lives, our desires and so on, are constructed by a world in which men have the power.
So there's someone who really is taking the scheme as being all that we are ever in touch with. And everything, all our experience is being formed totally within the scheme, and seeing as her task, one of her tasks, the breaking through of those time-encrusted schemes.
It's not a new idea that getting in touch with true reality requires breaking through the time-encrusted schemes accepted by society. In 4th century BC Athens, Plato described the same problem in the parable of the cave. We are all like prisoners in a cave, shackled facing a wall. Behind us, objects are paraded past a fire.
The prisoners see nothing of themselves or each other except for the shadows each one's body casts on the back wall of the cave. Similarly, they see nothing of the objects behind them except for their shadows moving on the wall. Now, imagine the prisoners were able to talk with each other. And suppose their voices echoed off the wall so that the voices seemed to be coming from their own shadows. Then wouldn't they talk and refer to these shadows as if the shadows were real? For the prisoners, reality would consist of nothing but the shadows.
Plato does think that The reason a lot of people are passive about their views and pick up their views is that cultural forces in society encourage them to do that. In The Republic, he goes on at great length about the main cultural forces in his contemporary society, which of course are not like ours. He spends a lot of time on Homer and on tragedy, public performances, public events of a cultural nature. And in our society, the cultural power that he would be worried about would not be that at all. It would certainly be TV, something that you see in your own house, but nonetheless has this cultural power. It presents all this stuff to you, which is very attractive and which you take in passively, and you come to accept it, and then you come to think that's the way things are, that's the real world.
In the parable of the cave, one prisoner is freed from his chains and forced to climb out of the cave and view reality in the light of the sun. Plato's message seems to be that only by thinking for yourself and thinking rigorously can you find your way through to true reality and not just accept values imposed by others.
Hey kids, dinner's ready. Turn off the TV. Come on over.
Birthday, dear Grandma.
But can we ever really know where the line is between what comes from society and what is independent of us? What is real? Is reality in the lifetime or the moment? Is reality in matter or in our minds, physical or spiritual? Is reality in the world outside us or in how we think about things? When we are with family or friends, are we in the same reality as when we are alone or in a strange place? Or do we spend our lives moving from one reality to another? The Examined Life is a 26-part series for college credit. To purchase a video cassette or transcript of this program, call 626-796-7300 or visit us online. Please order by program number.